Billionaire, humiliated a homeless woman at the bank, but what she revealed shocked everyone. Get ready to witness one of the most incredible stories you'll ever hear. Today, we're diving deep into a tale that will leave you speechless, a story about judgment, redemption, and the power of human dignity. If this story touches your heart like I know it will, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell so you never miss our incredible true stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Let's begin. The November rain fell in steady sheets across downtown Chicago, turning the bustling financial district into a maze of umbrellas and hurried footsteps. Steam rose from manholes, creating ghostly wisps that danced between the towering glass buildings that pierced the grey sky like modern monoliths. The wind carried the scent of wet concrete and exhaust fumes, mixing with the aroma of coffee from nearby cafes and the distant smell of Lake Michigan. Street vendors quickly covered their wares with plastic sheets, while taxi drivers navigated through puddles that reflected the neon signs and traffic lights like scattered jewels on black velvet. Among these giants of steel and glass stood the prestigious First National Trust, its marble facade gleaming even under the overcast heavens, a symbol of wealth and power that had dominated LaSalle Street for over a century. The building's neoclassical architecture spoke of old money and established power, its massive columns supporting an edifice that had weathered the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and countless economic upheavals. Bronze lions flanked the entrance, their eyes seeming to judge everyone who passed beneath their eternal gaze. Margaret Chen sat huddled against the bank's ornate entrance, her weathered hands clutching a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps, God bless." The cardboard was soggy from the rain, the letters beginning to blur and run, but she held it steady anyway. At 62, her face bore the harsh lines of someone who had weathered more storms than most could imagine. Each wrinkle told a story of sleepless nights, missed meals, and the constant worry that came with having nowhere to call home. Her greying hair, once meticulously styled for board meetings and charity galas, now hung in damp strands around her shoulders, escaping from beneath a knitted cap that had seen better days. The designer coat she wore, though now faded and torn at the edges, still held traces of its former elegance, a ghost of the life she once lived. The wool was still good quality, the cut still flattering despite the wear and stains. If one looked closely, they might notice the subtle designer label at the collar or the way the coat had been tailored to fit her frame perfectly. But most people didn't look closely at homeless individuals. They saw the surface, the worn clothes, the cardboard sign, the desperate circumstances, and made their judgments accordingly. She had been sitting in the same spot for 3 weeks now, watching the endless parade of well-dressed professionals rush past her, as if she were invisible. The morning crowd was always the most hurried, men and women in expensive suits clutching their briefcases and smartphones, their minds already focused on meetings and deals and profits. They moved with purpose and confidence, their steps clicking against the pavement in a rhythm that spoke of schedules and deadlines and important places to be. Some dropped coins into her coffee can without making eye contact, their guilt appeased by the small gesture. The coins would clink against the metal with a hollow sound that seemed to echo her hollow stomach and hollow heart. Others pretended she didn't exist at all, stepping around her with practiced indifference, their peripheral vision somehow managing to avoid her completely. A few would glance her way with expressions of disgust or pity, but those looks hurt almost as much as being ignored entirely. But Margaret noticed everything, the way people's expressions changed when they saw her, the unconscious tightening of purses, the protective way parents pulled their children closer. She had become a student of human nature from her position on the sidewalk, learning to read the subtle signs of compassion, fear, guilt, and indifference that played across the faces of passers-by. She could tell who might drop $1 into her cup and who would cross the street to avoid her entirely. The irony wasn't lost on her. 20 years ago, she might have been one of them. rushing past a homeless person without a second thought, too consumed with her own importance to acknowledge their humanity. She remembered her own reactions to panhandlers when she was climbing the corporate ladder, how she would fumble for loose change while secretly judging their choices and circumstances. Life had a cruel way of teaching lessons, she reflected, pulling her coat tighter against the biting wind that whipped between the buildings like a living thing, seeking to strip away what little warmth she had managed to preserve. The lunch crowd was different from the morning rush. People moved more slowly, some chatting with colleagues as they headed to restaurants or grabbed food from street vendors. Occasionally, someone would stop and actually speak to her, asking her name or how long she had been on the streets. These conversations were both a blessing and a curse. They reminded her that she was still human, still visible, but they also forced her to relive her story over and over again, each telling making the pain feel fresh and raw. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret noticed a commotion near the bank's main entrance. The usual flow of pedestrian traffic seemed to part like the Red Sea, people stepping aside to make way for something or someone important. Then she heard it, the low, expensive purr of a high-end German engine. A sleek black Mercedes S-Class pulled up to the curb, its engine purring like a contented cat. The car was immaculate, its paint job so perfect it seemed to absorb and reflect the city's lights simultaneously, creating an almost mirror-like surface that spoke of professional detailing and meticulous care. The vehicle came to a stop with precision, the driver clearly skilled at navigating the busy streets of downtown Chicago. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened with the solid thunk that only comes from German engineering and premium materials. From the driver's seat emerged a man who commanded attention without saying a word, his very presence seeming to shift the energy of the busy sidewalk. Richard Blackwood stepped onto the sidewalk with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in his life. At 45, he was the embodiment of American success. Tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. The fabric moved with him like liquid, clearly tailored to his exact measurements by craftsmen who understood that every stitch was a reflection of the man who wore it. His silver hair was styled perfectly, not a strand out of place despite the wind, and his steel blue eyes held the cold calculation of a man who saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities, profit margins and bottom lines. His shoes were handcrafted Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the lights of the city like small beacons of prosperity. His watch was a Patek Philippe, the kind of timepiece that cost more than most people's cars, and was passed down through generations as an heirloom. Everything about him spoke of wealth, power, and the absolute certainty that came from never having to worry about money, security, or where his next meal would come from. Blackwood was a legend in Chicago's business circles, whispered about in boardrooms and social clubs with a mixture of admiration and fear. The CEO and founder of Blackwood Industries, he had built an empire spanning real estate, technology, and finance from nothing more than a small inheritance and an unshakable belief in his own superiority. Forbes estimated his net worth at $3.2 billion, making him one of the youngest billionaires in the Midwest. His penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan from the 62nd floor of a building he owned. His garage housed a collection of exotic cars that would make most enthusiasts weep with envy, and his name graced buildings across 3 states. He was, by every measurable standard, a titan of industry, but success had come at a price that even his vast wealth couldn't fully compensate for. Richard's first marriage had crumbled under the weight of his ambition, his ex-wife Laura taking their 2 children to California, where they lived lives he funded but rarely participated in. His daughter Emma was now 21, studying at Stanford, and barely speaking to him except when she needed money for tuition or living expenses. His son Marcus was 18, about to graduate high school, and viewed his father as more of a quarterly bank deposit than a parent. His second marriage was more of a business arrangement than a romance, a union between two powerful families that looked good in the society pages, but felt hollow in the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts. Victoria Blackwood was beautiful, sophisticated, and perfectly suited to be the wife of a billionaire, but their relationship lacked the warmth and genuine connection that Richard sometimes found himself craving in his more vulnerable moments. They lived parallel lives in the same house, attending the same social functions and sharing the same bed, but rarely truly connecting on any meaningful level. He had everything money could buy: multiple homes, private jets, access to the most exclusive clubs and restaurants, the ability to make or break careers with a single phone call. Yet something indefinable remained, just beyond his reach, a hollow feeling that seemed to grow larger with each acquisition, each successful deal, each milestone that should have brought satisfaction, but instead left him feeling strangely empty. As Richard approached the bank's entrance, his polished Italian leather shoes clicked against the wet concrete with military precision. Each step was purposeful, calculated, part of the image he had carefully constructed over decades of climbing the corporate ladder. He was running late for a board meeting that would determine the fate of a small community development project on the South Side, a decision that would affect hundreds of families, but represented barely a rounding error in his overall business portfolio. The project was insignificant to his bottom line, a few $1 million in a portfolio worth billions, but the optics were important. It was the kind of thing that looked good in press releases and helped maintain his carefully crafted public image as a philanthropist and community leader. His public relations team had advised him that supporting urban development projects played well with voters and regulators, helping to offset some of the more controversial aspects of his business practices. He was mentally reviewing his talking points for the meeting, considering how to frame his inevitable opposition to the project in terms that would sound reasonable and fiscally responsible rather than simply greedy when something caught his peripheral vision. At first, he almost dismissed it entirely. Just another homeless person, the kind of urban fixture he had trained himself to overlook like traffic signs or fire hydrants. But something made him look again. That's when he saw her. Margaret looked up as the expensive shoes stopped directly in front of her, water from the rain creating small puddles around them that reflected the grey sky like scattered mirrors. She raised her eyes slowly, taking in the perfectly pressed pants with their razor-sharp creases, the crisp white shirt that probably cost more than she had eaten in weeks, the silk tie that was knotted with mathematical precision. When she reached his face, she saw something she recognized. Not kindness, but the cold assessment of someone sizing up a problem to be solved or avoided. His face was angular, all sharp edges and controlled expressions that spoke of years of negotiating and intimidation. His eyes were the pale blue of winter ice, and they seemed to look through her rather than at her, as if she were an obstacle to be navigated rather than a human being to be acknowledged. There was intelligence there, certainly, but also a hardness that suggested he had long ago stopped seeing people as anything other than assets or liabilities in the grand calculation of his success. "Excuse me?" Richard's voice was cultured, carrying the polished tones of an Ivy League education and boardroom authority. But there was an edge to it, a sharpness that suggested his patience was already thin, that he viewed this interaction as an unwelcome delay in his important schedule. "You're blocking the entrance to the bank." Margaret looked around, genuinely confused by his assertion. She was sitting to the side of the main doors, clearly not obstructing anyone's path. The entrance to First National Trust was grand and spacious, designed to accommodate large crowds during busy periods. The wide marble steps could easily accommodate dozens of people, and she had positioned herself carefully near one of the bronze lions, far enough from the main flow of traffic to avoid being in anyone's way. She had been mindful of this from the beginning, not wanting to give anyone a legitimate reason to ask her to move. "I'm not blocking anything, sir," she replied quietly, her voice carrying traces of an education that seemed at odds with her current circumstances. Despite weeks of living on the streets, sleeping in shelters when space was available and doorways when it wasn't, she still carried herself with a dignity that suggested a different past. "I'm sitting off to the side, out of everyone's way." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle twitching beneath the perfectly shaved skin. He was accustomed to immediate compliance, to having his requests, no matter how unreasonable, fulfilled without question. In his world, when Richard Blackwood spoke, people listened and obeyed. Employees scrambled to accommodate his wishes, business partners deferred to his judgment, and even his equals in the business world treated his opinions with the reverence due to someone whose net worth could fund small countries. The fact that this woman, this nobody, was contradicting him in public struck him as an affront to the natural order of things. It challenged the fundamental assumption upon which he had built his world view, that money and power created a hierarchy that everyone understood and respected. Her quiet defiance felt like a crack in the foundation of his carefully constructed reality. "Look, lady," he said, his voice growing colder, ice forming around each word. "I don't know what your story is, and frankly I don't care. But you're making the customers uncomfortable, and that's bad for business." As if summoned by his raised voice, a small crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the unusual sight of a well-dressed businessman confronting a homeless woman. Office workers on their afternoon breaks, shoppers heading to nearby stores, tourists with their cameras and guidebooks, all stopped to watch this unexpected drama unfold on the steps of one of Chicago's most prestigious financial institutions. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something noteworthy was about to unfold in an age where viral moments could emerge from anywhere at any time. Others simply stopped to watch, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity, discomfort, and the guilty fascination that comes from witnessing someone else's humiliation from a safe distance. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with shame, not because of her circumstances, but because of the public humiliation. She had once commanded boardrooms herself, had made decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars in corporate assets. She had sat at conference tables where billion-dollar deals were negotiated, had given presentations to boards of directors, had been quoted in business journals and invited to speak at industry conferences. The memory of that power, of the respect she had once commanded, made this moment cut even deeper than it might have for someone who had never known what it felt like to be treated as an equal among the powerful. "I'm not bothering anyone," she said, her voice stronger now, despite the tremor she couldn't quite suppress. The words came out with more force than she had intended, drawing attention from passers-by who might otherwise have walked on without noticing the confrontation. "I have as much right to be here as anyone else." The defiance in her voice seemed to ignite something dark in Richard's demeanor. He stepped closer, his presence looming over her seated form like a storm cloud gathering before a tornado. At 6 feet 2 inches, he was already an imposing figure, and the expensive suit and perfectly groomed appearance only added to the sense of authority and power that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. When he moved closer to someone, especially someone in a vulnerable position, the effect was intentionally intimidating. "Right?" he laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was cold and sharp, like glass breaking against concrete. "You think you have rights? You're sitting here begging for handouts, contributing nothing to society, taking up space that could be used by paying customers, and you want to talk to me about rights?" His voice was rising now, carrying across the plaza and drawing more attention from passers-by. Margaret could see people stopping on the sidewalk, could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Some faces showed sympathy, others disgust, but most displayed the uncomfortable fascination people have when witnessing someone else's degradation. It was the same morbid curiosity that drew crowds to accident scenes and made reality television popular. The guilty pleasure of watching someone else's misery from a position of safety and superiority. "Let me explain something to you about rights," Richard continued, his voice taking on the lecturing tone he used in boardrooms when explaining basic concepts to people he considered his intellectual inferiors. "Rights are earned through contribution, through productivity, through adding value to society. They're not just handed out to anyone who shows up with their hand extended, expecting the world to take care of them." Margaret's hands began to shake, not from the cold, but from a rage she hadn't felt in years. This man, this stranger who knew nothing about her story, nothing about the circumstances that had led her to this moment, was reducing her entire existence to a simple narrative of failure and laziness. He was making assumptions about her character, her history, her worth as a human being, based solely on her current appearance and circumstances. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the crowd. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of pain, loss, and injustice that this stranger could never begin to understand. "I know enough," Richard shot back, his eyes never leaving hers, boring into her like lasers cutting through steel. "I know you're sitting here instead of working. I know you're asking for money instead of earning it. I know you're the kind of person who expects society to take care of you instead of taking care of yourself. I know you've made choices that led you to this pathetic situation, and now you want everyone else to pay for those choices. Am I wrong?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, daring her to defend herself, to explain her circumstances to someone who had already made up his mind about who she was and what she deserved. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that this confrontation was building to some kind of climax. Phone cameras were recording now, capturing every word, every expression, every moment of this unexpected drama playing out on a busy Chicago sidewalk. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, a wall she had built around her pain, beginning to crumble under the weight of his accusations and assumptions. For weeks, she had endured the looks, the whispers, the casual cruelty of a society that preferred to pretend people like her didn't exist. She had learned to accept being invisible, being dismissed, being treated as less than human by people who couldn't imagine finding themselves in her position. But this was different. This wasn't casual indifference or unconscious prejudice. This was deliberate, calculated humiliation from someone who had the power to simply walk away, but chose instead to grind her deeper into the dirt for the entertainment of strangers and the satisfaction of his own superiority complex. "You want to know what I know about you?" she said, rising slowly to her feet with a dignity that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, some reserve of strength that had survived everything life had thrown at her. Even standing, she had to look up to meet his eyes, but there was something in her posture, in the way she carried herself, that commanded attention and respect despite her circumstances. "I know you're the kind of man who measures his worth by the size of his bank account," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I know you surround yourself with people who tell you what you want to hear, who validate your sense of superiority and never challenge your assumptions about the world. I know you've never had to wonder where your next meal is coming from or whether you'll have a warm place to sleep tonight. I know you've never had to choose between buying medicine and buying food, never had to swallow your pride and ask strangers for help just to survive another day." Richard's eyes narrowed, his perfectly controlled expression showing the first cracks of uncertainty. The woman's articulation, her bearing, the way she carried herself despite her circumstances, it didn't match his expectations of what a homeless person should be. There was something unsettling about her confidence, something that suggested depths and complexities he hadn't anticipated. Her words hit too close to home, revealing insights about his character that made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't fully articulate. But he was too far committed to back down now, especially with so many people watching, recording, waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve. His reputation, his image, his sense of himself as someone who was always in control, All of it was on the line in this ridiculous argument with a homeless woman outside a bank. "And I know," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that was somehow more threatening than his earlier shouting, "that you're about to find out what happens when you mouth off to the wrong person." He pulled out his phone with theatrical precision, making sure everyone could see his actions, could understand the power he wielded and the consequences that would follow from challenging him. "I'm calling security," he announced to the crowd as much as to Margaret. "Maybe a night in jail will remind you of your place in the world, teach you some respect for people who actually matter." But Margaret was no longer listening to his threats, no longer focused on his anger or his phone or his promises of consequences. Something in his posture, the way he held his head when he was angry, the particular shade of his eyes when the light hit them just right, the subtle mannerisms that emerged when he was under stress. It had triggered a memory she had buried so deep she had almost convinced herself it was just a dream. Her mind raced backward through the years, through the layers of pain and loss and heartbreak that had brought her to this moment. 23 years of wondering, of searching, of hoping against hope that someday she might see a face she recognized, might find the missing piece of her heart that had been torn away when she was too young and powerless to fight back. And suddenly, impossibly, she knew. "Richard," she said softly, and something in the way she spoke his name, with familiarity rather than fear, with recognition rather than submission, made him freeze mid-motion, his finger hovering over his phone screen. Richard Blackwood. The color drained from his face like water from a broken dam. Nobody here should know his name. He hadn't introduced himself, and while his face might be familiar to some from business journals and society pages, homeless people weren't typically part of that demographic. The wealthy and powerful moved in circles that rarely intersected with the desperate and forgotten, and there was no reason why this woman should have any knowledge of who he was or what his name might be. "How do you know my name?" he asked, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence, uncertainty creeping in around the edges of his carefully controlled composure. The phone in his hand suddenly felt heavy, forgotten, as his mind struggled to process this unexpected development. Margaret's laugh was bitter, filled with decades of pain and irony, with the cruel humor of a universe that seemed to delight in impossible coincidences and tragic reunions. "How do I know your name?" she repeated, shaking her head in disbelief at the cosmic joke that had brought them together in this way, at this moment, under these circumstances. "Oh, Richard, I know your name because I gave it to you." The words hit Richard like a physical blow, like a punch to the solar plexus that left him gasping and struggling to understand what he had just heard. The crowd, sensing that something profound and impossible was happening, pressed closer, their earlier amusement at the confrontation replaced by a hushed recognition that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be talked about and shared and remembered long after they had all returned to their normal lives. Phones were recording now, capturing every word, every expression, every moment of this impossible encounter for posterity and for the viral fame that would inevitably follow. But none of that mattered to Richard, whose mind was reeling as he tried to process the implications of what this woman had just said. "That's impossible," he whispered, but even as the words left his mouth, he was studying her face more carefully, looking beyond the weathering and the pain to the bone structure underneath. There was something familiar about her features, something that nagged at the edges of his consciousness like a half-remembered dream or a song heard in childhood that haunts the memory without revealing its source. Margaret reached into her coat with trembling fingers, her hands shaking not from the cold or from fear, but from the overwhelming emotion of this moment she had dreamed about for more than 2 decades. She pulled out a small, weathered photograph that had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had become permanent scars across its surface. The image was faded and cracked, damaged by years of being carried in pockets and purses, of being looked at during long nights when hope was the only thing standing between despair and surrender. The photograph clearly showed a much younger version of herself, a woman in her 20s with bright eyes and unlined skin, holding a newborn baby wrapped in a blue blanket. The woman in the picture was radiant with new motherhood, her face glowing with love and wonder at the tiny life cradled in her arms. She turned the photo so Richard could see it, and on the back, in faded ink that had somehow survived decades of handling, was written in careful script, "Richard, age 3 days, my beautiful boy." "I'm Margaret Chen," she said, her voice breaking as 23 years of separation, pain and longing poured into those 4 simple words. "I'm your mother." The photograph fluttered from Richard's nerveless fingers like a dying bird, landing in a puddle at their feet, where the rain immediately began to blur the ink and damage the already fragile image. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. Even the constant noise of the city seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of rain on concrete and the thundering of Richard's heartbeat in his ears as his world shifted on its axis. He stared at the woman before him, and suddenly the familiar features weren't just familiar. They were his own, reflected back at him across decades of time and oceans of pain and loss. The shape of her eyes was identical to his own, the stubborn set of her jaw a genetic gift he had carried his entire life without knowing its source. The way she held her head when she was angry, the mannerisms he had just been using as weapons against her, they were mirrors of his own behavior, inherited traits that connected them across all the years of separation. How had he not seen it before? How had 23 years of separation blinded him to something so fundamental, so obvious now that it had been revealed? "No," he breathed, taking a step backward as if physical distance could somehow make this revelation less real, less devastating to everything he thought he knew about himself and his history. "No, my mother is dead. She died when I was 5 years old. My father told me she died in a car accident. There was a funeral." Your father told you what he needed you to believe," Margaret interrupted, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the man her baby boy had become, successful and powerful, but also cold and cruel in ways that broke her heart. Because the truth was too complicated, too messy for the image he wanted to project for you and for himself. Richard's mind reeled, struggling to process information that challenged everything he thought he knew about his life, his identity, his very foundation as a person, his entire life story. The narrative upon which he had built his sense of self was cracking like ice in spring, revealing depths and currents underneath that he had never suspected existed. He remembered his father, Robert Blackwood Sr., a stern man who had raised him with rigid discipline and unwavering expectations. Robert had been demanding but fair, pushing Richard to excel in school, in sports, in every aspect of his development. He had provided the best of everything: private schools, tutors, summer camps, college preparation courses, all the advantages that money could buy and connections could secure. He remembered the story he had been told about his mother, that she had died in a tragic car accident when he was too young to remember her clearly, that it had been too painful for his father to talk about, that there were no pictures because seeing them made Robert too sad to function. It had been presented as a mercy, a kindness to spare a young boy from painful memories, and his father from overwhelming grief. There had been a funeral, or at least he thought he remembered one, a vague memory of a church, flowers, his father crying quietly in the front row. But the memories were hazy, filtered through the confusion of a 5-year-old mind, and possibly shaped by years of assumption and reconstruction rather than actual experience. "You're lying," he said, but the words lacked conviction, spoken more from desperation than belief. "This is some kind of elaborate scam. You saw my name somewhere, did some research, found old records." Margaret reached into her coat again and pulled out a small music box. Its paint chipped and faded, its melody mechanism clearly broken from years of handling and hope. The box was shaped like a carousel, with tiny painted horses that no longer moved to music that no longer played. Despite its damaged condition, it had been carefully preserved, wrapped in tissue paper that showed signs of being refolded countless times. "Do you remember this?" she asked, holding it out to him with hands that shook with emotion. "I used to play it for you when you couldn't sleep, when you were teething, when thunderstorms scared you. It played Brahms' Lullaby. You would calm down the moment you heard the first few notes, would relax in my arms and drift off to sleep." Richard's knees nearly buckled under the weight of sudden recognition. He did remember, not clearly, not with the sharp focus of conscious recollection, but in the hazy, emotional way that childhood memories survive when they're buried deep enough. The soft melody, the feeling of absolute safety, the warmth of arms that held him close and chased away all the fears that seemed so enormous in the darkness of a child's bedroom. It was one of his earliest memories, one he had attributed to a nanny or caretaker because his father had told him there was no one else who could have provided that comfort. But now, looking at the music box, hearing her voice, seeing the love and pain in her eyes, the pieces began to fall into place with devastating clarity. "But why?" he whispered, his voice that of a lost and confused child rather than a powerful businessman worth billions of dollars. "Why did he tell me you were dead? Why did you disappear from my life? If you're really my mother, how could you abandon me?" The pain that flashed across Margaret's face was so intense that several people in the crowd gasped audibly, recognizing the depth of suffering behind her expression. "I didn't disappear, Richard," she said, her voice thick with tears and years of suppressed anguish. "I was erased." The crowd around them had grown larger, but it felt somehow more respectful now, as if everyone present sensed they were witnessing something sacred and terrible, a reunion that was both miraculous and tragic in ways that defied easy understanding. Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, gathering strength to tell a story she had never spoken aloud to another soul, a truth that had lived inside her like a cancer for more than 2 decades. "Your father and I met in college," she began, her voice stronger now, despite the tears that continued to flow down her cheeks. "Northwestern University, 1978. I was studying business administration with a focus on international markets, and he was getting his MBA. We fell in love, or at least I thought we did. He was charming, ambitious, everything I thought I wanted in a partner." She paused, looking out across the busy street as if seeing into the past, as if the ghosts of her younger self and Robert's younger self were walking among the current pedestrians and traffic. "When I got pregnant with you, we were both 22, barely out of school ourselves. We had dreams, but no real plans, ambition, but no clear direction. Your pregnancy wasn't planned, but once we knew about it, once we had time to process what it meant, we were both excited about becoming parents." Richard listened with growing fascination and horror, his worldview continuing to shift and realign as she spoke. He had never heard any of this before, had never been told anything about his parents' relationship or the circumstances of his birth. His father had always deflected questions about the past, focusing instead on the future and the expectations he had for his son. "At first, Robert seemed genuinely happy about the pregnancy," Margaret continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone revisiting old wounds that had never properly healed. "We got married quickly. A small ceremony in December of 1978. Just immediate family and a few close friends. Nothing elaborate, but it felt right at the time. We were young and in love, and convinced that everything would work out perfectly." She smiled sadly at the memory, then continued. "But as you grew inside me, as the reality of parenthood approached, Robert began to change. His family had expectations, you see. Big expectations. The Blackwoods were old Chicago money, with a reputation that went back 3 generations. They had built their wealth in banking and real estate, and they had very specific ideas about who their son should marry and what kind of life he should lead. Richard felt the world spinning around him as pieces of his family history clicked into place. His father's family had indeed been prominent in Chicago society, their name associated with several major financial institutions and real estate developments. But he had never heard any mention of his mother being Chinese, had never been told anything about her background or her family's heritage. "After you were born," Margaret continued, her voice growing heavier with each word, "things got much worse. Robert's parents made it clear that I was unsuitable for their family's image. They had done research into my background, discovered that my parents were working-class immigrants from Taiwan who ran a small restaurant in Chinatown. They found out about my father's struggles with gambling, my mother's limited English, our family's financial problems." She paused, the pain of those memories still fresh after all these years. "They offered me money to disappear, to give up my parental rights, and let them raise you as they saw fit. $250,000, which seemed like an impossible fortune to a 23-year-old woman whose parents were struggling to keep their restaurant afloat. But I refused, of course. You were my son, my everything. I couldn't imagine a life without you in it." Her voice grew bitter as she continued, the old anger and hurt surfacing despite her attempts to remain composed. "But I was young and naive. I didn't understand how much power they really had, how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. I thought that being your mother would be enough, that the law would protect my rights, that Robert would eventually stand up to his parents and choose his family over their approval." Richard was staring at her now, his earlier anger completely forgotten, replaced by a growing sense of horror at what he was learning about his own history. The pieces of his childhood were rearranging themselves in his mind, creating a picture he had never imagined, revealing truths that challenged everything he thought he knew about the people who had raised him. "But surely the courts wouldn't just take a child away from their mother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are laws, protections." "The courts did exactly what courts do when one side has unlimited resources and the other side has nothing," Margaret interrupted, her voice filled with the bitterness of someone who had learned hard lessons about justice and power and the ways they intersected in America's legal system. "When you were 3 years old, Robert filed for divorce, but it wasn't just divorce. He claimed I was an unfit mother. His family had lawyers, investigators, private detectives, resources I couldn't even imagine. They spent months building a case against me, painting me as unstable, irresponsible, a gold digger who had trapped their son into an unwanted marriage." She stopped, wiping away tears that seemed to come from some inexhaustible well of pain. "They dredged up every mistake I'd ever made, every moment of uncertainty I'd shown as a young mother, every argument Robert and I had ever had, and twisted them into evidence of my inadequacy. They found witnesses who would testify that I was neglectful, that I left you alone while I worked, that I was having an affair, all lies, but lies told convincingly by people who were being paid very well for their testimony." Richard felt sick, his stomach churning as he began to understand the scope of what had been done to his mother, to him, to their family. "But surely you had legal representation, someone to defend you." Margaret's laugh was hollow and bitter. "I had a public defender who was handling 50 other cases and had maybe an hour to spend on mine. Robert's family had a team of the best lawyers in Chicago, men who specialized in custody battles and knew exactly how to manipulate the system. They had investigators who could find dirt on anyone, expert witnesses who would say whatever they were paid to say, connections to judges and court officials that went back decades." She reached into her coat once more and pulled out a bundle of legal documents, yellowed with age and worn from handling. They got temporary custody first, claiming it was just until the divorce could be finalized and proper arrangements made. Then they kept filing motions, demanding psychological evaluations, requesting supervised visitation, making it impossible for me to see you except under the most controlled and humiliating circumstances. Richard took the documents with shaking hands, scanning through pages of legal language that documented the systematic destruction of his mother's parental rights. The dates told the story. Motion after motion, hearing after hearing, appeal after appeal, all designed to wear down a young woman with limited resources and no powerful allies. I was given supervised visitation rights, Margaret continued. 3 hours every other Saturday, always monitored by a court-appointed observer who wrote down everything I said and did. Even those visits were conditional. If I couldn't afford the fees for the supervisor, if I missed a single appointment, if the observer reported anything they considered concerning, the visits could be suspended. She paused, her voice breaking with emotion, and they were suspended eventually, when I couldn't afford the court fees and legal representation needed to maintain them. When I missed one appointment because I was working 2 jobs just to pay for the lawyer who wasn't really defending me anyway. When the supervisor reported that I was emotionally unstable because I cried when I had to say goodbye to you. Richard was staring at the documents now, seeing his own name throughout the legal paperwork, seeing himself referred to as a piece of property to be divided rather than a child who needed his mother's love. The coldness of the language, the clinical way his custody had been discussed and decided, made him feel sick in ways he couldn't fully articulate. "But what about after the divorce was finalized?" he asked. "Didn't you keep fighting?" Margaret reached into her coat again and pulled out another bundle, this one consisting of letters held together with a rubber band that had clearly seen better days. The envelopes were addressed to Richard Blackwood at various Chicago addresses, all in the same careful handwriting he now recognized from the photograph. "I wrote to you," she said, holding them out with trembling hands. "Every week for 10 years, I wrote you letters. I sent them to your father's house, to your school, to addresses I found through private investigators when I could afford them. I told you about my life, about your grandparents, about the Chinese heritage you were being denied. I sent pictures, gifts for your birthday and Christmas, anything I could think of that might help you remember that you had a mother who loved you." Richard took the letters, noticing that they all bore return stamps or addressee unknown markings. Every single one had been returned unopened, creating a paper trail of rejection that must have broken his mother's heart over and over again. "They all came back," Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every single letter returned without being opened. But I kept writing anyway, hoping that someday, somehow you would know that I never stopped loving you, never stopped thinking about you, never stopped hoping that we would be reunited." The postmark spanned from 1985 to 1995, a decade of attempts to reach a son who had been told his mother was dead. Richard's hands trembled as he held the unopened letters, imagining the pain his mother must have felt with each returned envelope, the hope that must have died a little more with each proof that her attempts to reach him were being blocked. "I hired private investigators when I could afford them," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as she told her story, as if sharing this burden she had carried alone for so long was giving her strength. "I learned that your father had remarried when you were 6, a woman from the right family, with the right pedigree, someone who would fit seamlessly into Chicago's social elite. I learned that you were excelling in school, that you were being groomed to take over the family business, that you were growing up believing I had never existed." She paused, looking directly into his eyes, with an intensity that made him feel like she was seeing into his soul. "I learned that you were becoming everything your father wanted you to be, successful, ambitious, powerful, and I told myself that maybe that was enough, that maybe you were better off without the complications I would bring to your life." Richard's mouth was dry, his mind struggling to process the implications of everything she was telling him. "But why didn't you try harder? Why didn't you keep fighting?" Margaret's expression grew infinitely sad. "Oh, Richard, I did fight. I fought for 15 years, with everything I had. I spent every penny I earned on lawyers and court fees and private investigators. I worked 3 jobs to pay for legal bills that kept growing no matter what I did. I mortgaged my parents' restaurant, sold everything I owned, went into debt that took me years to pay off. Her voice grew quieter, more intense. And every time I got close to seeing you, every time I found a new lead or a legal avenue that might work, your father's family would find a new way to block me. They had me arrested for harassment when I showed up at your school, just hoping to catch a glimpse of you. They got a restraining order when I tried to attend your high school graduation. They made sure that any attempt I made to contact you was portrayed as the actions of an unstable woman who couldn't accept reality. Richard felt as though the ground was shifting beneath his feet, as though everything solid in his life was proving to be built on quicksand. What about when I turned 18? Didn't that change anything? I thought it would, Margaret admitted, hope and pain warring in her expression. I thought that once you were legally an adult, you'd be able to make your own decisions about whether you wanted a relationship with me. So I tried one more time. I hired one last lawyer, spent my life savings on one final attempt to reach you. What happened? Richard asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. Your father's lawyers destroyed me, Margaret said simply, her voice matter-of-fact, despite the devastating nature of what she was describing. They sued me for harassment, for stalking, for violating restraining orders I didn't even know existed. They painted me as a delusional woman who had become obsessed with a family that had rejected her years ago. They brought up every financial struggle I'd ever had, every job I'd lost, every relationship that had failed, and used it all as evidence that I was unstable and potentially dangerous. She wiped her eyes again, but continued with quiet dignity. The legal bills buried me completely. I lost my apartment, my job, what little savings I had managed to accumulate. Everything I had worked for 20 years to build was gone in a matter of months. Richard felt physically sick. And then I gave up, Margaret admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I finally realized that my attempts to reach you were only making your life more complicated, potentially causing problems for you that you didn't need or deserve. Your father had built you a new identity, a new story, a new family. And maybe that was better for you than the messy truth of what had really happened. She looked out across the busy street, her eyes distant with memory. So I stopped fighting. I got a job in Seattle, started over completely, tried to build a new life for myself, far enough away from Chicago that I wouldn't be tempted to keep trying to contact you. I told myself that loving you meant letting you go, that being a good mother meant accepting that I couldn't be part of your life. But you're here now, Richard said, gesturing at their surroundings with a trembling hand. In Chicago, sitting outside this bank, what happened to change that? Margaret's face aged 10 years in the space of a heartbeat, the weight of recent tragedy settling over her features like a shroud. Cancer, she said simply, the word dropping between them like a stone into still water, creating ripples of understanding and horror. Ovarian cancer, stage 4. I was diagnosed 18 months ago. Richard felt the world tilting beneath his feet. Oh, God. The treatment ate through my savings, my insurance, everything I had managed to build in Seattle. Margaret continued, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had accepted their fate, but still struggled with its implications. Chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, experimental treatments, all of it expensive, all of it ultimately unsuccessful. When I became too sick to work, I lost my apartment. When the treatment stopped working and the doctors told me there was nothing more they could do, I made a decision. What decision? Richard whispered. I came back to Chicago, Margaret said, her voice filled with a quiet dignity that somehow made her circumstances even more heartbreaking. I came back here to die, but more importantly, I came back here hoping to see my son one more time before I left this world. Richard's legs felt weak, and he found himself sitting down heavily on the marble steps of the bank, his expensive suit getting wet from the rain-soaked stone. You came back here to find me. I've been sitting on these streets for 3 weeks, Margaret confirmed, settling down beside him despite the wet concrete and the curious stares of the crowd. Different locations around the financial district, hoping against hope that maybe somehow our paths would cross. I knew you worked somewhere in this area, knew you were successful in business. I thought maybe if I was patient enough, visible enough, fate might give me one last gift. She laughed bitterly at the irony of their situation. I never imagined it would happen like this, with you angry and threatening to have me arrested. I never imagined that when I finally saw my son again, he would be trying to humiliate me and drive me away. The words hit Richard like physical blows, each one a reminder of his behavior just minutes earlier, of the cruelty he had shown to a woman who was not only innocent of his assumptions, but was, impossibly, the mother he had mourned his entire life. The billionaire, the titan of industry, the man who commanded respect and fear in boardrooms across the country, began to cry openly on the steps of First National Trust. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, reaching out to touch her face as if to convince himself she was real, that this wasn't some elaborate dream or hallucination brought on by stress and guilt. "I'm so sorry for what I said, for how I treated you. I didn't know. I couldn't have known." Margaret caught his hand and held it against her cheek, feeling the warmth of her son's touch for the first time in more than 20 years. "You have nothing to be sorry for," she said firmly, her own tears flowing freely now. "You were a child who was told a story, and you believed it because children trust the adults in their lives to tell them the truth. The fault isn't yours, Richard. It never was." "But I should have known," he insisted, his voice breaking with the weight of regret and lost time. "I should have felt something, should have recognized you somehow. There should have been some instinct, some connection." "How could you?" Margaret asked gently. "You were 3 years old when we were separated. Your memories of me were systematically erased along with everything else. Besides," she added with a weak smile that somehow managed to be radiant despite their circumstances, "I don't look much like the woman who used to rock you to sleep and sing you lullabies." Richard studied her face more carefully now, and with the knowledge of who she was, he could see past the weathering and the pain to the woman underneath. She had his eyes, the same deep brown that looked almost black in certain light. She had his stubborn chin, the same determined set to her jaw that he recognized from looking in the mirror every morning. She had his hands, long-fingered and elegant even when weathered by hardship and illness. How had he missed it? How had 23 years of separation and his father's lies blinded him to something so fundamental, so obvious now that it had been revealed? "What do we do now?" he asked, feeling lost and overwhelmed in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood. For the first time in decades, Richard Blackwood didn't know what came next, didn't have a plan or a strategy or a clear path forward. Margaret's smile was radiant despite her tears, despite their circumstances, despite the crowd of strangers watching their reunion unfold. "Now we talk," she said, her voice filled with hope for the first time in years. "We have 23 years to catch up on, and however much time I have left, I want to spend it getting to know the man my baby boy became." She reached out and took his hands in hers, marveling at how large they had grown, how strong they felt. "I want to hear about your first day of school, your graduation, your first business deal, your wedding, everything I missed. I want to know about your dreams, your fears, your hopes for the future, and I want to tell you about the woman who gave you life, about your grandparents who would have loved you so much, about the family and heritage you never knew you had." Richard nodded, unable to speak through his tears. Then, without caring who was watching or what they might think, without considering his reputation or his image or the viral videos that would inevitably result from this moment, he wrapped his arms around his mother and held her close for the first time since he was 3 years old. She felt so small, so fragile in his arms, but also incredibly strong. She had survived 23 years of separation, poverty, illness, and heartbreak, and she had still found the strength to hope for this moment, to believe that love could overcome even the most impossible circumstances. The crowd around them began to disperse slowly, many wiping away tears as they went back to their daily lives, but some remained, drawn by the profound nature of what they had witnessed. Among them was Sarah Martinez, a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, who had been on her way to cover a routine city council meeting when she stopped to watch what she initially thought would be another example of the callous treatment of the homeless. Instead, she had witnessed something unprecedented, a reunion that read like the most improbable fiction but was playing out in raw, unfiltered reality on a busy Chicago sidewalk. She had recorded much of the encounter on her phone, initially thinking she might write a human interest piece about homelessness and dignity, but now realizing she had captured something far more significant. As Richard and Margaret held each other, Sarah approached carefully, not wanting to interrupt this precious moment, but recognizing the importance of what she had witnessed. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice respectful and gentle. "I'm Sarah Martinez, a reporter with the Chicago Tribune. I couldn't help but witness what just happened, and I was wondering if you might be willing to share your story with our readers." Richard looked up, his executive instincts warring with his emotional state. Part of him wanted privacy, wanted to guard this precious moment from public scrutiny and media attention. But another part of him recognized the power of what had just happened, the lessons embedded in their story that could help other families, other people who might be facing similar circumstances. "What do you think?" he asked Margaret, deferring to her judgment in a way that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. Margaret considered the question carefully, thinking about the years of silence, the decades of secrets, the lies that had shaped so many lives in ways both small and profound. "If our story can help other families avoid what we went through," she said finally, "if it can make people think twice before making assumptions about the homeless, if it can encourage someone to dig deeper into family mysteries that might not be what they seem, then yes, I think we should tell it."